Ladies and gentlemen, focus is not just a mental habit, it's a biological signal. When you focus your attention on a task, goal, or internal process, specific regions of your brain begin to coordinate in powerful ways. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning, decision-making, and self-control, becomes highly active. At the same time, your brainstem and thalamus filter out irrelevant stimuli. What you're doing, in effect, is shaping the internal environment of your brain to support one clear objective: execution. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The act of focusing triggers a cascade of neurochemical changes. Dopamine, which is widely misunderstood as a pleasure chemical, is released when your brain detects progress toward a goal. But dopamine is not about reward in the sense of pleasure. It's about motivation, drive, and the pursuit of something meaningful. And dopamine release is not random. It's tightly linked to your perception of being in control of your effort. When you focus, especially when that focus is self-directed and deliberate, you give your brain the conditions it needs to work with intensity and precision. Imagine a spotlight in a dark room. Without it, your mind jumps from shadow to shadow, distraction to distraction. But with that spotlight on, your mental and neural resources are concentrated. That's when learning happens. That's when performance scales. That's when you begin to create long-term, lasting changes in your brain, what's known as experience-dependent neuroplasticity. There is also a cost to a lack of focus. When your attention is scattered, checking your phone, comparing yourself to others, switching tasks rapidly, your brain is flooded with noise. Cortisol, the stress hormone, rises. You become reactive instead of proactive. You're no longer in control of your attention. Your attention is being hijacked, and this state rewires your brain to normalize distraction. Over time, you condition your nervous system to seek novelty, not depth. That's the biological reality of drifting attention. It erodes the very circuits responsible for discipline and long-term thinking. In contrast, sustained focus strengthens the neural pathways involved in executive function. It creates efficiency in the brain. You're teaching your nervous system that certain tasks, thoughts, and actions matter more than others. This is a process called synaptic pruning, the brain's way of keeping what's useful and removing what's not. When you focus consistently on your goals, you're literally sculpting your brain to become more aligned with your purpose. But focus isn't just about mental effort, it's also physiological. Your pupils dilate when you're deeply focused. Your respiration changes, your heart rate slows or quickens depending on whether the task is cognitive or physical. This is your autonomic nervous system adapting to meet the demands of what you're doing. Focus recruits your whole body into alignment. That's why high performers across disciplines, athletes, scientists, creators, train their focus like a muscle. Because it is a system that can be trained, and it's not about long durations. What matters is the intensity and consistency of your focus, even in short windows. Research shows that deep focus work in intervals anywhere from 30 to 90 minutes can be profoundly effective. These intervals trigger what's called transient hypofrontality, a state where your brain becomes more immersed, less self-critical, and more capable of entering flow. In this state, your brain becomes a tool for output, not just consumption. It's also worth understanding that focus is not passive. It's an active, energy-consuming process. The brain accounts for only about 2% of your body weight, but uses over 20% of your metabolic energy. Focus work is metabolically demanding. It burns glucose, it fatigues neural circuits. That's why you feel drained after intense concentration. But it's also why this state is so powerful. When you focus, you signal to your brain this matters, and in return, your brain adapts chemically, electrically, and structurally. The reward? A clearer mind, a stronger nervous system, a brain wired for resilience and results. Silence is not the absence of noise. It's a biological tool, a condition that allows the nervous system to reset, recalibrate, and regain control. In a world where stimulation is constant, silence becomes a form of neurological recovery. It is one of the most powerful, yet underestimated interventions for mental and physiological regulation. Your nervous system is constantly scanning the environment for information. This is done through a network called the reticular activating system, RAS, which sits in the brainstem. It filters incoming sensory data, what you hear, see, feel, and determines what's important. In noisy, high-stimulus environments, the RAS becomes hyperactive. It floods the brain with input, increasing the activity of the sympathetic nervous system, the branch responsible for alertness, stress, and silence acts in direct opposition to that state. When you enter a quiet environment, especially if you do so deliberately, your parasympathetic nervous system becomes dominant. This is the branch of your autonomic nervous system that controls rest, recovery, and repair. Heart rate slows, breathing deepens, blood pressure decreases, cortisol levels drop. In real, measurable interventions for mental and physiological regulation, your nervous system is constantly scanning the environment for information. This is done through a network called the reticular activating system, RAS, which sits in the brainstem. It filters incoming sensory data, what you hear, see, feel, and determines what's important. In noisy, high-stimulus environments, the RAS becomes hyperactive. It floods the brain with input, increasing the activity of the sympathetic nervous system, the branch responsible for alertness, stress, and silence acts in direct opposition to that state. When you enter a quiet environment, especially if you do so deliberately, your parasympathetic nervous system becomes dominant. This is the branch of your autonomic nervous system that controls rest, recovery, and repair. Heart rate slows, breathing deepens, blood pressure decreases, cortisol levels drop. In real, measurable brain shifts from reaction to integration. This is not a passive state, it's a deeply active one, just directed inward rather than outward. There's also a structural component to this. One study demonstrated that prolonged exposure to silence actually led to neurogenesis in the hippocampus, the part of the brain associated with memory formation and emotional regulation. This suggests that silence isn't just soothing, it's reparative. It restores and rebuilds parts of the brain worn down by stress and stimulation. Another key mechanism is breath. In silence, breath becomes more perceptible. That awareness creates a feedback loop. When you become conscious of your breath, you begin to regulate it. And when you regulate your breath, you regulate your nervous system. The vagus nerve, a key player in the parasympathetic system, responds to this kind of intentional breathing. The result is a measurable decrease in sympathetic tone. You feel more grounded, centered, and capable of reflection. But silence is not merely about being in a quiet place. It's about creating space between stimulus and response. In silence, you reclaim that space. Instead of reacting, you observe. Instead of filling the void with noise, whether external or internal, you learn to sit with it. That discomfort is instructive. It reveals the nervous system's baseline. It shows you where you truly are, not where you've been distracted into believing you are. Modern environments are designed to override this. Notifications, alerts, conversations, headlines, all of them stimulate the brain's attentional networks, pulling you out of self-regulation and into external reaction. Over time, the nervous system adapts to this constant stimulation. It begins to crave it. That's how dysregulation becomes normalized. The body learns to exist in a near constant state of low-grade stress. Silence disrupts that pattern. It introduces stillness into systems that are otherwise stuck in a loop of activity. This doesn't mean withdrawal or disconnection. It means resetting the baseline. When you withdraw from external input, even briefly, you allow your prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for conscious control, to re-engage. You move from a reactive mode to a reflective one. The longer you stay in silence, the deeper this recalibration can go. Silence then becomes a form of training, a neurological exercise. Just as focused attention builds cortical strength, silence builds regulatory depth. It increases your tolerance for uncertainty. It strengthens your emotional boundaries. It teaches your nervous system how to downshift without relying on external validation or constant distraction. Dopamine is often misunderstood. It's frequently associated with pleasure, reward, and excitement, but its primary role in the brain is far more nuanced and fundamental. Dopamine is not about the outcome, it's about the anticipation and pursuit. It is the neurochemical of motivation and progress, not passive pleasure. And understanding this shifts the way you approach work, discipline, and personal growth. Dopamine is released in the brain when you perceive forward movement toward a meaningful goal. That release is what creates drive. It's what tells your brain, this is worth doing again. From a biological standpoint, it acts like a marker reinforcing patterns of behavior that are associated with survival, adaptation, and competence. This is why the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, which originates in the ventral tegmental area, VTA, and projects into the nucleus accumbens, is so critical in goal-directed behavior. The brain doesn't release dopamine simply because you achieve something. In fact, the larger dopamine spikes often occur during effort, not after it. When you are making progress, taking steps, however small, towards something that matters, dopamine rises. The nervous system interprets that movement as a sign of control, of agency, of effectiveness in the environment. This is what makes progress intrinsically reinforcing if you know how to tune into it. Contrast this with noise, constant stimulation, empty affirmation, or the social reward loops of modern technology. These are designed to create dopamine spikes without actual progress. A like on a post, a message, alert, a viral headline, these are microstimuli that trigger shallow surges in dopamine. But those spikes are decoupled from real movement toward personal goals. They create a loop of paminergic misalignment. You feel temporarily rewarded, but you haven't built anything. You haven't moved. The danger here is neuroplasticity. The brain adapts to what it experiences repeatedly. If you train your brain to expect dopamine from external validation or passive consumption, you begin to wire your motivational system to seek stimulus, not substance. Over time, this desensitizes the dopamine system. The same inputs give you less satisfaction. You begin to need more noise to feel anything. This is the same neurochemical process involved in addiction, not just to substances, but to distraction, to comparison, to external approval. Progress, by contrast, generates sustainable dopamine release. When you set a clear goal and start taking measurable steps, whether it's reading one page, completing one rep, writing one paragraph, your brain tracks that. The anterior cingulate cortex monitors the gap between where you are and where you want to be. When it detects that the gap is closing, it signals the VTA to release dopamine. That release then enhances focus, improves energy levels, and increases the likelihood that you'll keep going. This is the feedback loop of effort-based reward. There is also a cognitive layer to this, meaning and intent. Dopamine is released more strongly when you assign personal significance to the progress. In neuroscience, this is called subjective reward valuation. The same task can trigger different levels of dopamine depending on whether or not it's aligned with impinging your internal goals. When you focus on what matters to you, not what gains social approval or noise, you build a self-reinforcing reward system. One of the most powerful tools for tapping into this system is to learn how to attach dopamine to the process, not just the outcome. This is not abstract, it's biochemical. When you deliberately acknowledge small wins, your brain associates effort with reward. This builds grit. It strengthens motivation circuits in the dorsal striatum and prefrontal cortex, reinforcing self-initiated behavior over time. But this requires silence, reflection, self-awareness. It requires withdrawing from the noise long. enough to perceive what progress actually looks like for you. Without that clarity, you're left chasing echoes of motivation, empty stimuli that keep your brain busy but not fulfilled. The brain thrives not on chaos but on coherent input. Dopamine systems are designed to help you pursue long-term outcomes, not short bursts of stimulation. Cognitive energy is a real, measurable, and exhaustible resource. The brain, despite making up only about 2% of your total body weight, consumes approximately 20% of your body's energy at rest. That energy is not unlimited. Every thought, decision, and action carries a metabolic cost. This means that the quality and direction of your mental energy, where you place your attention, what you choose to engage with, and how often you switch tasks have direct consequences on your performance, mood, and capacity for sustained effort. Cognition is powered by a mix of electrical activity and chemical signaling. Neurons communicate using action potentials, which require fuel in the form of glucose and oxygen. These resources are delivered via blood flow and consumed during even the simplest cognitive processes. When you engage in complex thinking, problem-solving, decision-making, or focusing intently, your brain increases its demand for those metabolic fuels. Over time, especially without deliberate recovery, the system fatigues. This fatigue isn't just about feeling tired. It has structural and functional effects. As the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for executive function, becomes taxed, your ability to exert self-control, delay gratification, and maintain goal-directed behavior diminishes. This is why, after hours of multitasking or dealing with constant interruptions, even small decisions can start to feel overwhelming. It's not a character flaw, it's neurobiological depletion. Understanding that your cognitive energy is finite is not about doing less, it's about doing what matters most with intensity and clarity. Every interaction, every distraction, every notification you allow into your field of awareness demands attention. Tension, once engaged, takes time to disengage. This is due to what's known as attentional residue, a cognitive lag where part of your brain remains fixated on the last task even after you've switched to a new one. The more frequently you switch tasks, the more fragmented your energy becomes. This is how energy leaks occur, not from overexertion alone, but from constant redirection. Mental clarity relies on conserving attentional bandwidth. You have a limited number of high-quality decisions, deep focus windows, and emotionally regulated responses available each day. If you spend them early scrolling social media, engaging in unnecessary debates, reacting to other people's agendas, you'll have less left for what's meaningful. The anterior cingulate cortex, which governs error detection and effort allocation, becomes overwhelmed when constantly bombarded by competing inputs. This impairs your ability to prioritize, making everything feel urgent even when it's not important. The myth of limitless mental energy leads many people to burnout in the name of productivity. But the truth is, your brain operates within cycles. These cycles, known as ultradian rhythms, typically last 90 to 120 minutes. During that time, your alertness, working memory, and concentration rise and then decline. When you ignore these rhythms and push through fatigue without breaks, you begin drawing on stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline to sustain focus. That strategy works for a while, but it creates long-term dysregulation of your nervous system. Cognitive energy is also drained by decision fatigue. Each choice, even seemingly small ones, carries a processing cost. This is why high-performing individuals often structure their environments to reduce trivial decisions. Routines, minimalism, and intentionality are not aesthetic, they're neurological safeguards. They protect executive function for higher-order tasks that require true cognitive investment. Just as physical strength is built through effort and recovery, cognitive stamina is built through focus and renewal. This means carving out deep work blocks where distractions are minimized and goals are specific. It also means creating intentional periods of disengagement, walks without your phone, meals without screens, silence without inputs. These aren't luxuries, they're required for optimal neural function. Glucose is replenished through nutrition, but mental energy is restored through what scientists call default mode activity, the introspective, diffuse thinking state that occurs when the brain is at rest. This is why boredom, quiet, and solitude often lead to creative breakthroughs. You're on else, not I in these moments. It's processing, organizing, integrating. This background processing is critical for mental clarity and long-term memory consolidation. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change. It is how your brain rewires itself in response to experience, behavior, thought, and environment. Every skill you develop, habit you form, or belief you reinforce is encoded through plasticity. This process is not abstract or philosophical, it is mechanical and biochemical. Neurons that fire together, wire together. That is not a metaphor. It's a literal description of how new circuits form and how old ones are weakened through disuse. But neuroplasticity is not automatic. It doesn't occur just because you read a book or try something once. The brain has evolved to be conservative with its resources. Change is permitted, but only when your nervous system detects that the change is useful and likely to recur. This is why repetition and focus are the two core ingredients required for plasticity to occur. When you repeat an action or thought pattern, you increase the likelihood that the associated neural circuits will be reinforced. This is known as long-term potentiation, the strengthening of synaptic connections between neurons that are repeatedly activated together. Over time, these connections become more efficient. Signals travel faster, less effort is required. This is how learning becomes memory and memory becomes identity. However, repetition alone is not enough. Focus is the amplifier. When you bring full, undivided attention to what you're doing, whether it's learning a new language, practicing a skill, or changing a behavior, you engage the prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive center. This region signals to deeper structures, including the basal ganglia and hippocampus, that what you're doing matters. Focus creates the neurochemical conditions for plasticity, particularly by increasing levels of acetylcholine and dopamine, two key modulators of learning. Acetylcholine sharpens attention. It acts like a spotlight, highlighting certain synapses while dimming others. This allows the brain to tag specific circuits for strengthening. Dopamine, on the other hand, marks relevance and reward. It signals that the effort being exerted has value, which encourages the brain to repeat the behavior. Without these neurochemicals present, the signal for plastic change is weak or absent. Distraction disrupts this process. When your attention is divided, when you are multitasking, reacting to notifications, or splitting focus between stimuli, you fail to create the intensity required for plasticity. The circuits you're trying to reinforce don't receive a strong enough signal, and your brain doesn't adapt. This is why casual repetition without deliberate focus rarely leads to mastery. Neuroplasticity also follows a timing mechanism. The brain enters heightened states of plastic potential when there is novelty, urgency, or emotional relevance. These states make the nervous system more receptive to change. If you combine this receptivity with repeated, focused practice, you can accelerate learning and behavioral transformation. But if you waste these windows of plasticity by focusing on shallow or distracting inputs, you reinforce randomness instead of intentional growth. Consider how habits are formed. Habits are nothing more than deeply grooved neural pathways created through repeated activation. But what you repeat is what you become. If you routinely engage in comparison, complaining, or avoidance, you are teaching your brain to default to those patterns. If, instead, you consistently engage in focus, goal-directed behavior, even in small doses, you are reinforcing resilience, direction, and discipline at the neural level. The nervous system is plastic throughout life, but the efficiency of change depends on how you engage it. Children and adolescents exhibit experience-expectant plasticity, where the brain is primed to adapt rapidly to the environment. Adults rely more on experience-dependent plasticity, which is slower but still highly effective, especially when paired with deep attention and consistency. Sleep is also essential for consolidating plastic changes. During slow-wave sleep, the brain replays patterns of neural activity that occurred during waking focus. This replay process helps move learning from short-term holding areas into long-term storage without sufficient rest. Especially deep sleep, the day's efforts at neuroplastic change are unlikely to be encoded. Ultimately, neuroplasticity is about repetition with intention. Your brain will adapt, but it will adapt to whatever you expose it to most frequently, with the most intensity, and with the greatest consistency of focus. Identity is not a static label. It is a process ongoing, adaptive, and shaped by experience, memory, behavior, and self-reflection. The brain builds identity the way it builds any internal model, through patterns. Repetition, emotion, and meaning combine to form what you believe about who you are. But these patterns do not form most strongly in noise. They form in silence. In the absence of distraction, your brain can actually observe itself. This is where identity takes shape, not in the external signals you receive, but in how you process and integrate them when the environment is quiet. From a neurological perspective, the sense of self is not located in a single region of the brain. It is a networked process involving the default mode network, DM, which includes the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and the angular gyrus. This system is most active when you are not focused on the outside world, when your attention turns inward. It becomes especially dominant during moments of silence, solitude, and rest. In these moments, the brain engages in self-referential processing, a process of analyzing your actions, beliefs, and internal narratives. This introspective state allows the nervous system to integrate past experiences with current values and future goals. But it requires space, neurological and psychological, to operate. When you're constantly engaged with external stimuli, the dim is suppressed. You're reacting, not reflecting. Over time, identity becomes reactive too, shaped by likes, opinions, metrics, and comparisons. These are not authentic signals. They are reflections of environment, not expressions of self. Silence removes the noise of external validation and forces you to confront the raw data of your internal experience. This is not always comfortable, but it is essential. In silence, the prefrontal cortex has the space to evaluate what actually matters to you, free from the filter of social expectations. You begin to hear the quieter signals: intuition, memory, curiosity, doubt. These are the building blocks of self-awareness, and without awareness, identity cannot stabilize. Neurochemically, silence supports identity development through dopaminergic recalibration. Constant noise, especially the kind delivered through digital platforms, trains your brain to associate self-worth with shallow, immediate feedback. This creates fragmented identity. Who you are depends on how others react, but in silence, those feedback loops are interrupted. Your dopamine system begins to shift from external reward to internal coherence. You begin to feel value in alignment, not applause. Memory plays a central role in identity, and memory consolidation happens in silence. During rest, particularly in non-REM sleep, the hippocampus communicates with the neocortex to file away significant experiences. Without that process, experiences do not become part of your personal narrative. Silence during waking life performs a similar function. It allows the mind to sort, weigh, and integrate events not just intellectually but emotionally. This is where meaning is formed. And meaning, not momentary feedback, is what constructs identity. In silence, the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, also begins to downregulate. As stress hormones like cortisol decrease, you regain access to rational, long-term thinking. This shift is critical for identity development because it transitions the brain from survival mode to reflection mode. You stop asking, how do I fit in? And start asking, who am I when no one's watching? That question can only be answered when the environment is still. Your habits also speak into your identity. What you do repeatedly becomes who you are. But if you never slow down, you cannot evaluate which habits are aligned with who you want to be. Silence gives you the cognitive bandwidth to notice your behavioral patterns and ask whether they are intentional or inherited. The basal ganglia, which stores procedural habits, responds to this evaluation through what's called behavioral gating, the process of choosing which patterns to reinforce and which to weaken. Silence does not mean passivity. It means attention. It's in those moments walking alone, sitting without your phone, pausing between tasks that you encounter the unfiltered version of your mind. The story you tell yourself when there's no script, no performance, no feedback. That's where the true architecture of identity is laid down, not in public declarations, but in private alignment between your thoughts, emotions, and values. The self is not built in motion alone. It is structured in stillness, layered in quiet repetition, and refined in the spaces between effort and outcome.